Unless you lived through World War II, it is difficult to truly appreciate the selflessness and utter determination of that generation. Tales of America's armed forces are numerous and legendary, and still don't do them justice. But all their heroic efforts did not go unaided.
Not much is really said, about the home front during the war in history. We read about the battles and the soldiers who won the war, but certainly the home front was instrumental in our industrial production, which really gave us an advantage on the battlefield.
During that war, it was so different than any other time because everybody was out to win that war.
Like our soldiers and sailors, the folks at home did their part out of an altruistic sense of patriotism and duty. These are some of the forgotten tales of life in Northwest Ohio during World War II. Port Clinton, Ohio is a small town on the shore of Lake Erie, almost halfway between Toledo and Cleveland. With Germany marching across Europe and Japan doing the same in the Far East, Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, requiring American men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register with their local draft board. By that time, however, a number of Ottawa County men had already joined the Ohio National Guard as part of Company C of the 192nd Tank Battalion based at Camp Perry.
The core of the company was the men from Port Clinton who had grown up together, lived together, played together. One of the fellows was a teacher at the high school and basketball coach, very popular. Anyway, these men all knew each other. The men of Company C were federalized in September of 1940.
That meant all the National Guardsmen around the United States were now U.S. Army soldiers, and they were activated. This was in response, of course, to the international events of the time. It was becoming obvious to some that the United States might eventually be involved in this global war.
They were sent down to Fort Knox to begin their training. Their training was scheduled to last about a year. And when they were down at Fort Knox is when all the other men, largely from Ohio, were added to the unit to make it full strength.
The men of Company C joined other Federalized Guard units to make up the 192nd Tank Battalion. Company A from Janesville, Wisconsin, Company B from Maywood, Illinois, and Company D from Harrodsburg, Kentucky. Like most small towns across the country, folks in Port Clinton followed the exploits of their hometown soldiers and sailors in the local newspaper.
They were in the paper all the time. They kept up with the 192nd pretty good, kept up with them, and everything that came through, they would publish.
If anybody sent any kind of letter home, the papers were also reporting, so-and-so received a letter, and in the letter it stated this.
9 months into their training, they found out that they were being shipped overseas instead of back home. Some members of the battalion were reassigned to other units because of their age or family status. 32 men from Port Clinton were with the 192nd when it arrived in the Philippines on November 21, 1941. They were stationed near Clark Airfield and spent the next 2 weeks settling in.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
Within hours, the Philippines were also under heavy attack.
Japs hit us about just right at noon and got all but 4 of them. We had 37 airplanes and they got all but 4 of them right on the ground. They were over Clark Field for an hour or so, strafed and bombed everything. And I've always said thank God for foxholes.
On December 22nd, the Japanese landed in force at Lingayen Gulf on the Philippine island of Luzon. The 192nd Tank Battalion was thrust into action in support of retreating American and Filipino forces and destroyed 6 Japanese tanks in the first tank-to-tank combat in U.S. military history. As the Japanese advanced, the U.S. forces withdrew onto the Bataan Peninsula to await reinforcements or rescue. Area newspapers described the desperate situation on Bataan, conveyed concern for the local men in harm's way. But the attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled America's ability to reach the Philippines by sea or air.
There for the next 3 months, they were basically holding out. With minimal food, minimal supplies, they were constantly being cut off from all of that.
They fought off the Japanese as much as they could with their provisions. They were always told they were going to get more help. They never got it.
MacArthur kept on saying that troops were on the way and all this kind of stuff, and there's no way that they could have saved us, really. Knowing what we knew at that time, we didn't have really much of a Navy, and it was too far for flights, so it was just a hopeless case. But we never dreamed that the Japanese wouldn't really take care of it.
April 9, 1942 marked the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in history, as 75,000 Americans and Filipinos were taken prisoner. The Japanese forcibly marched the sick and exhausted survivors 60 miles north on what would become known as the Bataan Death March.
We were allowed to take our canteens with us and our mess kits, that's all. And of course, we was on this thing for 5 days. And after the first day, of course, everybody's canteen was empty. And then the Japs initially would not let us get water. There's a lot of springs, artesian wells along the road. And guys would make a break for it, and they would fire at them. And I think the entire time we were allowed to fill our canteens twice, those 5 days. But you know, it's probably 100 to 110 degree temperature, and basically no food. And so the last days were real tough.
These were men who were already suffering from malaria, suffering from lack of food, lack of nourishment, and so they were weakened already. If they were lucky, their friends would be able to help try to carry them along.
The prisoners who survived the death march were first taken to Camp O'Donnell and then on to Cabanatuan, where mistreatment, malnutrition, and disease took its toll. Back home in Port Clinton, their families and friends struggled through 1942. They scoured the headlines, but there was little actual news of what had happened to the men of Company C.
John D. Manier, he was a tank driver. And the government just sent a note, said that he was captured. He was a prisoner of war.
They didn't know the extent of those experiences. They just knew that people were POWs. Nobody heard anything about the Bataan Death March until people were starting to get rescued, or until the few people who managed to escape told their stories. You know, they had no idea. No idea that their men, their family members were experiencing that kind of suffering.
In 1941, I was playing cards with my girlfriend, and we had the Philco radio. Franklin D. Roosevelt came on at 6 p.m. and declared that
the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I passed a guy on the street and he said, "Did you hear what happened today?" And I said, "No, I have no idea." He said, "The Japanese bombed Americans at Pearl Harbor." And he said, "I guess I have to say goodbye to you. You look like you're going to be going into the military." And I was in uniform 2 weeks later.
December 7th, 1941, a black day Americans will never forget. The Japs bombed Pearl Harbor.
The terrible news of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and the early days of the war galvanized the American spirit and inspired them to ensure the sacrifice of American lives was not in vain.
Within a matter of hours after the declaration of war against Japan, the nation began marshaling its resources for a fight to the death.
We really helped the American cause by being able to hold out as long as we did. The Japanese thought they'd take the Philippines within 2 or 3 weeks, and we held out for better than 4 months, and really hurt their time schedule. To give Americans 4 months, which to them probably wasn't a long time, but for us, the military gained a lot in those first 4 months of the war.
America was spurred into action. Some prepared for the worst. Millions of others went to work, providing the materials needed to win the war. And the industrial might of the Great Lakes was wielded like a weapon.
Owens, Illinois swung immediately into action, converting shops to the manufacture of diesel engine parts, gun turrets, small arms ammunition tool gauges, glass landmines, machinery, and other war products.
Really, when you look at the area from Detroit to Cleveland, you're talking just along Lake Erie about 170 miles, and a great deal of industrial production took place in this area. Factories were short of people to work, and just about any able-bodied person who could do something was employed, and many women went to work for the first time during World War II because of the labor shortage.
This is a war in which women hold responsible military positions on an equal footing with men. The ubiquitous Jeep is on every battlefield of the world, from Guadalcanal to Dutch Harbor. Women have clamped instrument dials to the dashboards of thousands of them.
New factories like the American Propeller Company were constructed to provide vital military equipment. After the war, it employed thousands in Toledo as GM's powertrain transmission plant. The Army also contracted with private industry to quickly build up its arsenal. Willys Overland built the mighty Jeep, aircraft parts, and munitions in their sprawling North Toledo factory. Libby Owens Ford produced tempered window glass for high-altitude bombers and lenses for pilot goggles. Dana made propeller shafts and transmissions for Jeeps and trucks. The Electric Auto Light Company built artillery fuses, airplane guidance systems, and operated a tank depot in the rail yards of South Toledo. The Toledo Tank Depot prepared armored vehicles for shipment overseas, sealing them against the ravages of weather and salt water, and packing them with all the necessary equipment to be operational within minutes. The employees of the tank depot were recognized by the military for their wartime production efforts. It closed in 1943 after the Army built a new facility in Lima. The Army operated more than 100 depots during World War II.
The main body shop building, 45 at Willys Overland, was empty, so the Army rented it and made a medical depot there where they packed field Army hospitals for overseas shipment.
In 1942, the Army broke ground on a massive new ordnance depot just south of Toledo in Rossford, Ohio.
The Rossford Ordnance Depot on the east side was the largest Army transportation depot in the country. It was just like a city unto itself.
There were 17 warehouses. The place was 2¼ miles long. We had 3 cafeterias, fire department, complete railroad system with roundhouse.
The railroad for Rossford picked up the cars that was delivered by the regular trains, and then they bring it on to the depot and put it wherever we're supposed to go.
Rossford Ordnance specialized in repairing or overhauling tactical vehicles and maintained an inventory of replacement parts for quick delivery to troops around the world.
The troops would put in the requisition, and we would load it, and it would go from here by rail to the ports, and then they would load it on the ship and take it to the Philippines and take it to Europe, wherever the troops were.
Most of the people there were civilian employees. It was a very large employer here in Toledo.
The pay was low, but most of the people in the area went to Libby Owens, They went to Sparkplug, they went to Dana, and those were good paying jobs for the war effort. The government didn't pay, but the government was regular. When you got a job there, they didn't have layoffs.
Of course, it was probably the first time any of us had any money. I think I started out at $21 a week.
Although the American military was segregated during World War II, blacks and whites worked side by side at Rossford Ordnance.
If you wanted a job and you were a person of color, you went to Rossford and got hired right away. But we didn't have any persons of color in the supervisory positions. I worked my way up. Finally, one day I got a break, and I was accepted as a supervisor for the job. I was the only one that got a good job.
Rossford Ordnance was closed in 1964, but the site later became home to Owens Community College and Penta County Vocational School. The Erie Proving Ground and Ordnance Depot was a large military complex located west of Port Clinton along the shore of Lake Erie.
The Erie Proving Ground was founded in 1918 during World War I. Artillery pieces were tested there. Of course, when the war ended, it's sort of deactivated, became the Erie Ordnance Depot, which meant it was an ammunition storage facility, basically. But after World War II began, again, it became the Proving Ground. Almost every family in Ottawa County and in the surrounding area probably had one family member that worked there during the war. It was that big.
They had building after building after building out there stored with guns. My God, they had some out there with barrels of 20 foot long, and they test fired all that stuff. 75% of all the guns that went overseas were tested at Erie Proving Ground.
Supposedly at the Erie Proving Ground in 1938, the M1 rifle was publicly tested there for the first time. And of course, the M1 rifle carried the American infantry on to victory in World War II. The lake was used as an impact area, so the shells, the artillery pieces, or the small arms fire would take place on land, and the rounds would of course land in the lake. For all those years, many, many rounds went into that lake.
Next door to the Erie Proving Ground was Camp Perry. Built in 1907 as an Ohio National Guard training facility and firing range. Its unique location made it an ideal site for the National Rifle and Pistol matches, where America's best marksmen would compete every year. The national matches were suspended during World War II, but Camp Perry still had plenty of visitors.
It served as a reception station initially, where soldiers from the area who were just drafted, for example, would go there first before they would go to their regular Army post. He fills out mounds of paperwork, gets issued clothing, and is sort of introduced to military life.
So I spent 6 weeks there. They gave me all the tests to be sure that I was physically and mentally fit for the military service, and I was, and so I passed everything, and they kept me there for a couple more weeks, and finally the word came that we were going to be shipping out.
Camp Perry also featured its own orchestra and theater and attracted some of Hollywood's biggest stars.
To boost morale, raise money through bond drives, famous actress Loretta Young came to visit. You had entertainers like Bing Crosby and Bob Hope visit. The people that lived, worked, visited, trained there, they're all people that we don't see their names in the history books, but they are the ones who helped win the war. That's the story, I think, of Camp Perry.
Camp Perry had the distinction of serving as an internment camp for POWs from Europe. These German and Italian POWs helped out on the farms in the area, farms and the factories in Northwest Ohio.
We talk of American industry, but certainly all of American agricultural power was put into the war too.
Our farmers over here were having problems because they didn't have anybody to help with their crops because their kids were all over there fighting. And somebody got the bright idea, let's bring the prisoners over here. So they were brought back here with the main idea of saving our crops. And that's basically what they did, although they ended up working in anything they could find for them to do. They worked in the canning factories, practically every canning factory around this area.
Now, Camp Perry was the largest camp, but there were satellite camps all over Ohio.
Bowling Green, Defiance, Salina. It was a 4-H camp. I went there as a little girl the year before, and I couldn't go. In 1944, they were bringing prisoners of war in.
German POWs were put to work for, and sometimes alongside, Ohioans who shared the same heritage and language. Both sides were given a chance to look beyond the propaganda and get a close-up view of the people they considered the enemy.
We were not supposed to talk to them. Well, when these people are all speaking the same language, which was Low German, they talked. They were thrilled to find out that we were not the enemy we had been depicted by their German officers and so forth. The people were very kind to them.
They were treated pretty well. I would hazard to guess that many of them were thankful to be there as opposed to being out on a battlefield.
The Italians didn't want to be in the war anyway, so they surrendered. They surrendered to troops. The troops said, man, I can't take care of you. Go over there and sit down. And that's the way they captured the Italian prisoners of war.
After Italy capitulated in 1943, their POWs were formed into Italian service units, which could work on military bases or wherever needed.
They worked at the ordnance depots, Marion Ordnance, Dayton, Columbus, Rossford.
We didn't have all of them, but they had a good amount of Italian prisoners of war here. They reached agreement where they could have their patch with Italy, and they got uniforms, and they did the work. I know the Italian prisoner of war one day said to me, Willie, the guard was asleep with the rifle in his lap. They didn't want to escape. They had a good time at Rossford.
The Italian service units were given liberty to tour area museums, attend theaters, even fraternize with local residents.
The thing I remember about Camp Perry, a lot of the guys I was there with were a little bit resentful because the girls who worked in the commissary and places like that were dating these former enemies. And boy, the guys used to get teed off about that. But a pair of pants was a pair of pants.
We made the choice. Hold in the Pacific, attack in Europe. First, we would attack Germany from the air. Then we would invade Europe and destroy the German armies. Our Pacific troops fought and held back a savage foe so that we might concentrate the full fury of our offensive power against Nazi Germany.
The tide eventually turned in the Pacific theater, and the Americans began retaking islands one by one.
As the war went on, and it appeared that the Americans were going to come back in and rescue these POWs, the healthy ones were actually sent then overseas to Japan and to the different work camps over there.
Although the Americans were coming, POW John Manier found himself moving deeper into enemy territory.
John was prisoner for 42 months. He went by boat from the Philippines to Mukden, Manchuria. He was a prisoner there. They were scattered all over, the men were.
Port Clinton lost quite a few men as the Japanese were trying to get the men over to Japan because they were killed in the hell ships.
They took us by boat, but they put us down in the hold and you had to stand up. And they packed us in. I don't know, there was 500 or 600 of us in the bottom of that thing, just packed in there. And we were on that thing for 38 days. I don't know how many guys died like flies. And they just pulled them up by a rope and took them out and dumped them overboard.
The hell ships were not marked as POW ships. The Japanese didn't mark them. We bombed our own POWs to sink those ships. And not until after they saw people coming up and out of the ship did they realize that was actually a POW ship. The Japanese had pre-printed POW cards, so you could only put so much information in it, and they, of course, would censor that information. Elmer Smith sent home this POW card, and Elmer had kind of put a little message in to his family so that they would send that message on to these other families. Regards to Kovac, Elias, O'Brien, Simon are gone. They read it as those people were gone. Kovac, Elias, O'Brien, and Simon are gone. Because there was no argon that anyone in that town knew.
For the folks at home, life went on as best it could. There were still the movie palaces downtown, like the Paramount, where you could watch the latest newsreels and lose yourself in a comedy or romance for a couple of hours. And places like the Trianon Ballroom, where you could forget your cares, if only for the night.
Oh yeah, sure I went to the Trianon, absolutely. Yeah, Trianon was great. Good bands, yeah, real good bands. There was a lot of dance halls. There was so much to do in Toledo that today I wonder what the kids do.
Rationing was an unfortunate necessity of World War II. Almost everything seemed vital to the war effort and was therefore diverted for military use. No one was happy about it, but people understood it was their patriotic duty to make do or do without some of life's little luxuries.
Most everything was rationed. Usually in the countryside, we had no problems. But my grandmother had a sister that lived in Lima, and she needed more meat coupons. And we lived on a farm, so we had our own meat. But we needed more sugar coupons to can foods in the summer and fall. And so the two would trade. Now, officially, you weren't supposed to do that, but everybody did it.
I didn't really miss it, but we couldn't have nylon stockings. But I got to be an expert with leg makeup. You had to be really good, man, to get that on without streaks. Some girls even painted the black line up the back, you know, because all nylons had a seam back then.
For Americans, the loss or restriction of their automobile may have been the toughest pill to swallow.
My dad was on the tire board where they had to dispense the tires to the people, and of course only doctors and people at school buses, school drivers and so forth, they were the ones who got most of the tires.
Of all the rationed items, gasoline was probably most precious. If you didn't have any gas, you either walked, took the bus or streetcar, and sometimes you could carpool with friends who were going your way.
I carpooled with enemies. Trust me, they weren't friendly, but they were the ones that went near me.
You did whatever it took to help win that war, and everybody was very conscious of it, that they were there, and we saved and we scrimped and did whatever we could.
Americans were also encouraged to buy war bonds and stamps to help pay for the war effort, and bond rallies were commonplace.
Oh yeah, war bonds was very important. All the signs you see, they were everywhere. Of course, everybody was very patriotic. Very, very patriotic.
We would have drives where we would buy stamps, military stamps, you know, put in your books, and you get so many books filled, and then you could get a war bond with it.
Yeah, I had a lot of bonds. Between the bonds and the money I saved was the down payment on my first house.
After a couple weeks of working, Catherine Koenig said to me, why aren't you registered for the draft? I said, well, I'm not 18 yet. She says, you're not 18? Well, you can't work here. You must be 18. So we'll have to terminate you. So I says, well, today just happens to be my birthday. So she said, well, you bring me your draft status tomorrow. I had my mother sign an affidavit saying that I was 18 as of that date. And I continued to work there. First thing, greetings. It was a standard letter, greetings and blah, 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 and away you went. At that time, everyone understood what greetings meant. That is your invitation to go to the induction center to be included in the military. I went out on Wall Street, that's where they had the induction center, with everyone from my neighborhood. I didn't pass. And finally I said to the doctor, what's the matter with me? He said, you're too little. In Ohio, you have to weigh 105 pounds. You only weigh 101. You have to be 5 feet tall. You're only 4'11". So until you grow, we can't use you. But after 2 more trips to the induction center, I grew and gained weight. I was 108 and 5 feet. So away I went.
During World War II, local Navy recruits spent some time at the Bayview Naval Armory in Point Place before heading out on the high seas.
One of the showplaces of Toledo is the new Naval Armory, largely built from salvaged material with the assistance of the Works program. Serving as a training center for Toledo's naval reservists and Marines, and as a civic and social center, the Armory contains a large drill deck, a gymnasium, rifle range, recreation rooms, and storage space. The bridge structure of a naval vessel is simulated by the balconies along one side wall. Even gunnery instruction is provided for in the complete equipment.
The Armory also hosted signalmen, yeomen, and ship storekeeper service schools. After the war, it was used as a naval separation center, where over 42,000 sailors were mustered out of the service. Thousands of Northwest Ohio men and women served their country during World War II. Their individual stories vary, but they share a common experience of courage, patriotism, and duty. Robert Craig attended Libby High School and worked at Tidkey's department store before joining the Army. In Sicily on July 11, 1943, Lieutenant Craig single-handedly eliminated a German machine gun emplacement that had pinned down his entire company. Later that day, when his platoon came under attack from a larger enemy force, Lieutenant Craig ordered his men to take cover, then charged the enemy position to draw their fire. He eliminated several of the attackers before he was killed. Lieutenant Robert Craig was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for action above and beyond the call of duty. The city of Toledo named the Craig Memorial Bridge in his honor. Sergeant Alex Drabick was another Toledo hero. As the Americans were driving toward Germany in 1945, Hitler ordered every bridge across the Rhine destroyed to slow their advance. Sergeant Drabick led his squad across the last remaining bridge at Remagen and secured positions on the other side. Alex Drabick was the first American to cross the Rhine. 8,000 U.S. troops were able to pour across the bridge in the first 24 hours. His heroic actions shortened the war and saved thousands of American lives in the process. For the men overseas, there was nothing better than letters from home.
That was a big deal. Letters from home, from my sweetheart from my old neighborhood. Wonderful woman. I look forward to her letters, and she used to look forward to mine.
50 years before email, the War Department developed Vmail as a method of reducing the shipping weight of millions of letters. Letters were first composed on a standard form that contained up to 400 typewritten words. The letters were then opened, sorted by destination, and photographed onto one frame of 16mm film. "70 pounds of film is a lot lighter than 37 tons of actual mail. Vmail was sent overseas by plane to distribution centers, where the process was reversed. The film was enlarged, and each letter was printed onto a 5.5 by 4-inch sheet, half the size of the original. The Vmail facsimiles were folded, placed in special envelopes, and then distributed via standard mail. Although Vmail couldn't contain photos, clippings, or the smell of your best gal's perfume, it saved a lot of time, not to mention space aboard cargo ships that were better filled by men and supplies. World War II took local men and women all over the world, but they never lost touch with what was going on back home.
Joe Gallen and Aaron Cohn were both very well-known people throughout the community, and they had watched a lot of their friends be called off to war. So they were looking for a way to allow them to give back to the war effort, and they came up with this novel idea of Mail from Toledo, kind of almost like a small, almost pocket-sized newsletter. I usually had anywhere from 10 to 15 pages. People from all over the community contributed to articles that were put in place. There might be descriptions of engagements that were going on, parties that were held. There was a sports section, descriptions of a boxing match or perhaps a high school football game. Pinups were real popular as well. They weren't necessarily sent out to specific units where they knew Toledo men were there. They were just shipped all over. So they were able to get these things distributed to people all over the world. In one little package, it truly was, mail from Toledo. It was a description of what was going on in the community back home.
On May 8, 1945, after years of suffering and sacrifice, the long-awaited news finally came.
There was nobody anywhere but out on the street in Toledo. A car couldn't have run down any street. It was solid people. Everybody was dancing and, oh yeah, it was really something. When you see those pictures, that's the way it was. Music and the confetti flying and everything. It was just fantastic.
If anything, the celebration was even bigger 3 months later, when the Japanese surrendered as well. In Port Clinton, the post-war celebration was tinged with apprehension, because the final fate of the men of Company C was still unknown.
The families from April of 1942 on, they really didn't know much until 44, 45. Several of these families only knew that their family members were listed as missing in action for the whole of that 3.5 years. And some of those listed as missing in action were actually dead. And so, to have that hope, these men are coming home, these people are being released, and then, to find out that your family member was not one of them.
Out of 32 that went, 10 came back. All their officers and that were killed, but a lot of them were brought back and buried here.
All them guys that were in the tank company, and God bless them, boy, I'll tell you, them guys really took it.
Jimmy O'Brien was the youngest member of Company C. He and 2 of his 4 brothers left Port Clinton High School to join the military.
We were a pretty close family, 5 boys and military family, and I went in the Navy. I was in not quite 2 years. I lost my 2 brothers, and they called me back. Jimmy, God bless him, he was captured and just beat to hell. We got word that he died in a Japanese prison camp. Ralph, I think he was 18 when he was killed in a Battle of the Bulge, and a German plane come in strafing. 8 of them were hit, and he was killed. He was the one out of the 8.
Although they died 2.5 years apart in different theaters of war, they were buried together in Port Clinton on the same day.
They held my one brother, Ralph, at Washington till the other one come back from the Philippines. Then they sent them both onto the mortuary here, where we had a double funeral. Port Clinton was a very, very hard-hit town.
Most of our Port Clinton guys didn't get rescued until August, September, October of that year, and were liberated by the Russians.
John Manier was one of the lucky ones.
He weighed, when he was captured, about 155 or so, and he got down to 85 pounds. But when he got home, he spent 3 weeks in the hospital in being fed well and that, all the nutrition and stuff like that. So he put on a little weight again.
All of the 10 Port Clinton survivors were finally home by Thanksgiving of 1945. They were embraced and welcomed by their community. Over time, they resumed a seemingly normal life, but the scars of their ordeal remained close to the surface.
Some of these men would have terrible nightmares and wake up screaming, and the only one they would allow anywhere near them was their wife at that time, because, they were afraid they might hurt their children.
When I was little, I couldn't go in the bedroom and talk to him. I had to stand at the door and holler, "Dad, wake up," because he would literally try to choke or get a hold of the person who would be trying to touch him. I wish I could tell you more, but he wasn't one to share the war stories. He and his friends would get together and talk about the war, but he really didn't share that much with me.
A lot of the men didn't want to talk about it. They couldn't remember, didn't want to remember. But some of them, like John was young enough that he did. He said, if we don't let it out, nobody would know what happened. And when they would get together, they would talk about it then. And I think that did them more good than somebody that kept it inside.
Port Clinton dedicated several memorials to the men of Company C, but none more enduring and symbolic of their sacrifice than the naming of a new elementary school.
We were told when we were in the Philippines that it means youth, Bataan does. And Kenny Thompson named that school Bataan School. Kenny said, well, rather than name it after one person that went over, from that group and that, we should just call it from the area, Bataan School. It just fit that school, I think.
They honored the contributions of those men. They love those men. They are proud of those men. And I don't think they're ever going to forget what those men did.
Many of the returning veterans used the GI Bill to go to college or trade schools. Others rejoined the workplace in the same jobs they held before the war.
In 1944, when victory seemed inevitable, President Levis spoke to his administrative heads.
There can be no question about those who left their work to serve in this war. Our program must demonstrate to them that they're welcome back and that this is still a land of unlimited opportunity. Above all, we must prove that our appreciation of their patriotic service does not end with this war. There is very little we can do, and nothing we can say, which will in any way compensate the valiant men who gave their lives for us. But we can make some small payment on our debt by our constant, sincere efforts to help adjust the lives of those who do come back. In doing this, we and you have a great responsibility and a privilege, for these men are the builders of our country's destiny. They are the future of America. Together, we must give these men a full measure of the time, the faith, the understanding and patience they deserve. Today, tomorrow, next year, and as long as the need exists. We're pledged to do it, we can do it, and we will do it.
After the war, millions of dollars worth of surplus was scrapped or sold to the public for almost nothing.
When I was a sophomore in Napoleon High School, our industrial arts teacher, he wrote into the government after the war and requested a Piper Cub type airplane. The government wrote back and they said, we have a Corsair airplane with 30 hours on the logbook that's in Baltimore, Maryland, that you can have for $150. He immediately went to the school board and asked for $150, but they wouldn't give it to him. So the jeweler, Reichert jeweler uptown in Napoleon, says, here's $150, go get it. The government flew the Corsair from Baltimore, Maryland to Metcalf Airport in Toledo, and it was never to be flown again. But we didn't know how we was going to get it to Napoleon. It was going to cost a lot of money to tow it down there or to disassemble it to take it to Napoleon. So we found a fellow that was had been with the Air Transport Command during the war, and he said he would fly that down to Napoleon. We made the arrangements with a farmer out north of Napoleon in these alfalfa fields. So he landed the plane there, took it up on the road, and taxied down the road with the wings down. Finally, he put the wings up. When he did reach Napoleon with it, we hooked Schneider's wrecker onto it and pulled it into Napoleon and parked it in front of the schoolhouse. Our industrial arts class made steps, wooden steps, so that you could look into the cockpit. So we had an airplane for $150. The school board, about 10 years later, was so afraid to let anybody have the plane or to sell it because it was still government property. So what they decided to do was to scrap it, and unfortunately they scrapped that airplane. Well, a lot of the kids that were in high school at the time picked up parts, and they were given to them, and they brought them home. And every once in a while, you'll hear of somebody that says, oh yeah, I got a part off of that Corsair airplane. That's the story of the Corsair airplane and what happened to it, unfortunately.
Otto Whitman spent the last days of World War II working for the Office of Strategic Services, America's precursor of the CIA. He was assigned to a special unit trying to locate and repatriate artworks stolen by the Nazis. During his time in the OSS, Otto met art professionals from all over Europe and the United States. making contacts and friendships with the future curators and directors of museums all over the world. Whitman put those contacts to work as director of the Toledo Museum of Art. Thanks to an endowment from Edward and Florence Libby, the Toledo Museum was one of the few institutions in the world with the resources to purchase art. Access to funds, combined with his network of wartime contacts, helped Otto Whitman to locate and acquire exquisite works of art that constitute 2/3 of the Toledo Museum's collection.
The World War II Memorial is an effort that was begun through the inspiration of a veteran named Roger Durbin from Berkey, Ohio, population 265.
He enlisted in the service. He was not drafted. And I think that speaks volumes not only about that generation, but also about the type of person Roger Durbin was. He served in the European theater. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was in the Rhineland, the Bastogne. He was just an impassioned patriot.
He had been in Washington in the early 60s and discovered that there was no memorial. He had been in Bastogne, Belgium in 1966 and had seen this 8-story high, star-shaped memorial that the Belgian people built for the Americans 5 years after the close of the war. And he said, if a people that had been so decimated by such a terrible war could do that within 5 years, why couldn't a prosperous country like the United States show its gratitude for everyone in the United States that had worked?
Came back home and didn't really say anything about it, didn't do anything about it until 1987 when he approached Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur at a Jerusalem Township fish fry, where he yelled across the room at her, "Hey, Congress Lady Kaptur, why is there no World War II memorial in Washington, D.C. where I can take my grandchildren?"
And everyone in the room was looking at us, and I said, "Well, sir," I said, "I think there is a World War II memorial." He goes, "Oh yeah, what is it?" And I said, "I think I would say Iwo Jima."
And he said, "Oh no, the Iwo Jima Memorial is to the United States Marine Corps, and it's to one battle, and it's located in Virginia. So for those reasons, it is not a national World War II memorial."
He had seen Marcy Kaptur in operation and knew that she was an extremely approachable woman to all our constituents, and she gives good, honest answers, and he knew he was putting her on the spot, but it was his way of trying to get across, we need to do something about this.
And I approached him, and we began a talk and developed a friendship that lasted for a decade and a half until his death in 2000. And we were able to develop legislation, pass 2 separate bills beginning in 1987 through 1993, pick the site. Roger was there with his wife Marion in 1995 when we dedicated the site. And then between 95 and his death in 2000, the preliminary plans and drawings and renderings and so forth were put together.
I know it's going to be there, and all my buddies know it. And they asked me what I wanted in the design. I said, I just want it to be there. So it's been a long, hard fight.
We had many legislative battles. There were 2 bills. We had opposition. We had people in the Congress who wanted to make this a private memorial rather than a public memorial and tried to stop our bills, tried to alter our bills. We had walkouts in committee meetings.
She stuck by this legislation. She could have easily, pushed it into a corner on her desk and let it ride. But because she saw the value and the need for this generation to be thanked, this bill passed and subsequent bills passed, and that is how the World War II Memorial, as we know it today, came to be. When Roger Durbin posed the question, he asked not for himself. He asked for his grandchildren and the grandchildren of his comrades. Because where better do you tell a story of your experience, especially a war experience, than at a memorial?
The goal was to create a plaza that would be a place for reflection. You're almost struck with a sense of awe because you can see the Washington Monument, you can see the Lincoln Memorial, and here you are in this area where there are waterfalls. The center point of the memorial is a wall of gold stars representing all those who have died during the war. You know what a major part of history you were. Every person who walks across that plaza.
He would absolutely be overjoyed with the review of the veterans. You know, it's so gratifying to see them and hear them and how pleased they are. They're going to the memorial and running their fingers over the letters of the battles that are engraved in the stonework. They're crying. People are asking them for their autographs. You know, this generation deserved this thank you when they came home. Because after all, the World War II generation did nothing less than save the world.
There's so much here. I mean, this was really the symbol of what the United States was at the time. We can be proud of the services of our soldiers and the many thousands of others who were in all branches of the service. The people who worked in the factories, building the arms and equipment, and certainly our agricultural might. All these were harnessed to a degree that has never been done before. I think Ohioans can be very proud of our part in World War II.